And now, from the University of Chicago Institute of Politics and CNN, The Axe Files, with your host, David Axelrod.
Stephanie Shriak's political sensibilities were forged in the labor struggles of her home city of Butte, Montana in the 1980s. And from there, she became one of the great organizers in Democratic politics. Her experience included managing several successful campaigns for the United States Senate as a pioneering finance director for the Watershed Howard Dean campaign in 2004. And now she's president of Emily's List, an organization that was formed 3 decades ago to encourage women to run for office. Well, it appears now that women don't need a whole lot of encouragement to run for office. We've seen women running all over the country. And the question is there a pink wave coming? I asked Stephanie about that and many other things when she dropped by the Institute of Politics last week. Stephanie Shriak, it's good to be with you and good to see you again.
Thank you.
You don't come from a particularly political family.
No, I don't.
Tell me about your folks.
That's great. Well, I grew up in Butte, Montana. Parents of good Midwesterners. My dad's born and raised in this little town called Mountain Lake, Minnesota. My mom was from Mason City, Iowa, and if you know anything about Minnesota and Iowa, they hate each other. So they overlooked their differences and got married. And
right on the border there.
Right on the border, yeah. Right? And then they moved out to Butte, Montana, where I was raised. And the funny thing about the whole family is that we never talked politics. Now, I was very active. I was that kid, right? I just wanted to change everything. I ran for student government all the time.
Several times, right?
Several times.
Not successfully.
Not very
Until
often.
The last, right. So you ran for student government president?
I did. I tried to be class president a few times, and I just was not convincing to my classmates. It didn't work.
Did you win ultimately?
Well, I figured something out as one of my first most important lessons of campaigning. I realized if I ran for student body president my junior year, the electorate changed. And it wasn't just my class, but the freshmen and sophomores were going to vote too. And so then I focused my entire campaign to the freshman and sophomore class. Mm-hmm. And in fact,
expanding the electorate.
That expanding the electorate deal is important.
Yeah.
And I learned my lesson. The other lesson I learned is I got the endorsement of one of the younger sisters of one of my opponents. Oh yeah. No,
and
this
that was
tough.
Telling.
It was,
if nothing else, it was a psychologically bruising thing
right.
to do.
There's one thing being a sister, but then I learned about the sisterhood. And that was it. And I did become the Butte High School student body president my senior year. Uh-huh. So I love that stuff. I always wanted to do that. My parents raised me to, do anything I wanted to do. I'm lucky that way. I get that. There wasn't any sense of there's any doors closed to you. And as a young woman, I don't even think I even thought about the fact of how lucky I was to have parents like that. And so I think that was a big part of it. And I was a type A kid, and I just wanted to do a little bit of everything. My mother was a Democrat, but my mom and I were so certain that my dad, who is he's a sportsman. He hunts and fishes. He's a gun owner. He owns quite a few, actually.
Yeah.
Vietnam veteran.
Yeah.
We just clearly was a Republican. And so my mom being
never inquired?
No, because they're Midwesterners. And my mom's like, don't rock the boat here, honey. We're just not going to talk politics. That's great. And I'm like, okay. I was very dutiful. And not until I went to college, and I was dating a Republican at the time. This was Mankato State, Minnesota, where I was in school. And my Republican boyfriend walks up to my dad and says, "Oh, how do you put up with this liberal daughter of yours?" And my father says, "Oh, I'm just really proud of her." I said, "Well, Dad, that's really nice, you being a Republican and all." And my dad says, "Are you kidding? I've been a Democrat my entire life."
All those years.
And then here's the big one. He says, "It's your mother that's the Republican." So
well, that's
what happened. Well, we all came out of the Democratic closet. We're like, we're all Democrats, and then we talk more about politics.
So let me ask you a question about your dad. And you mentioned he's a Vietnam veteran. He
Yes.
was a sportsman and a hunter and all of that. Talk about the gun issue, because it's very much on people's minds now. And I think we kind of talk past each other. I think I've told the story here before about Barack Obama, when he was a state senator, was having a debate with a guy from downstate on a gun issue. And he said, listen, I understand that you grew up hunting. Your father grew up hunting. This has been passed down from generations. And it's important to you. But he said, I come from a place where like mothers sit by the window and worry about whether their kids are going to come back from school alive because there's so much gunplay on the streets. He said there has to be a way to preserve your rights and your culture and all of your traditions and save these kids. And but we don't have those discussions like that. It's a very shrill discussion. And it becomes more so as you see these massacres, like the one we saw in Florida, and then the one at just as we speak, just this week at YouTube. Right. So, but I want you to talk about it from the other direction. First of all, did you go hunting when you were a kid?
I very proudly took my hunting safety course. I couldn't tell you exactly who was sponsored by, but I would not be surprised if it was not paid for and sponsored by the National Rifle Association, because that's what they do all over the country. I took it at 11 because you could get your permit at 12, so you were ready to go hunting. And then I went a couple times. It was so cold and there was so much snow that I was like, I don't know. And I went to Mom, I'm like, do I have to do this hunting thing? Is it okay if I get out of it? So that ended my hunt. I love to fish. I was much better at the fishing thing. But I grew up absolutely in a hunting household. And it wasn't that I just didn't like to be that cold. Honestly, that was the whole problem for me. We grew up eating game. I hardly ever had beef in the house, ever. We grew up eating venison and elk and ducks and pheasants, and that's who we were. And
sounds kind of good, actually.
It was really good, and we still do. I go home. My dad lives in Kansas now, and what's great is like the freezer's still filled with that. But you're right. We do talk past each other in this.
You've managed campaigns in places where this was Montana.
In Montana,
for one. Yeah.
where it really is part of the culture, and I had a shotgun all through myself. I had a shotgun all through high school, and my dad still has it at the house. And I've lived outside of Washington D.C. for a while now, so I don't have the shotgun. So I never really thought growing up about it. It was just a different time too, in the 70s and the 80s, that everybody had guns growing up, and everybody was respectful of those guns. That's why we had to go take the hunter safety course, or you sat down with Dad and you were taught how to clean and put together and take care of it, like every
and
step
fairness,
of it. Like it's a real, but it's a culture. It's a different thing. This is Montana,
right? But
this isn't Chicago.
And it is still, but it is still true. That's probably still true.
You bet it is.
And
my nephew's going through the process right now.
Right.
He'll learn the same things I learned from his dad.
And yet you read these polls and you see among gun owners, there is a majority for universal background checks,
yes,
for example.
And I think that's where we've got to get out of the extreme debate here, which is not the only issue we have this in, and try to find some common ground. And the background check piece of this seems completely sensible. My father is not an NRA member. I can't speak to if he ever has been. My uncle is. But they're very open to having some common sense laws put in place that protect people, with the background check being the easiest of those all. So why we can't come together on something as simple as a universal background check, I don't know.
Well,
it can get messier along the way, and I know they feel like it's a slippery slope.
Right.
Is the argument, right? But
how much of it is
we've got to have some common sense.
How much of it is that the
here.
NRA? I mean, growing up, you'd think of it as the voice for hunters and sportsmen, but it's also a big time lobbying group for the gun industry, which doesn't want any restrictions that would impinge on their bottom line, and it's become sort of a rallying place for these folks who believe that we should be armed against the hegemony of an overweening government, which is kind of crazy because there's no weapon you're going to buy, even an AK-47 or an AR-15 or whatever, that is going to stop a tank or a plane. But there is that element of it. But I don't think that's the majority of gun owners.
No, and I would guess that it's not the majority of members of the NRA. I mean, you talked about it is the National Rifle Association for so long is the voice of, hunting and fishing and all the, sort of that, and really sportsmen, the hunting side, not so much the fishing, not the angler side of it, but the hunting side of it. And a lot of folks that I'd run into in Montana when I was managing John Tester's race, or even in Minnesota, they're members because there's benefits to being a member of the NRA, and you get access to, interesting and new equipment, or you get to read information that makes you better at hunting, and so much of it is that benefit. If you separate that and say, boy, it's a benefit to those folks, that's what they're looking for. To me, like that's a good association. The lobbying power, though, and the unwillingness to have any conversation, that's unacceptable, and that is really where I think they've gone just.
I think we're also reaching a tipping point where and you can see, and I think the Parkland kids get a lot of credit for this, but you can see that. In what happened in Florida and some other legislatures, what just happened in Vermont, that it's just becoming untenable to hold the line and say we're not going to do anything. That seems like an increasingly difficult position. But as you say, it's not just on guns. There's so many issues on which we run to our corners, and I think it's one of the problems we have in the country. I think the president himself is deeply responsible in that he exploits these divisions expertly and with great panache. I'm sure, I don't know that he'd call it panache, but with great enthusiasm. But let's get back to
which is very dangerous to our democracy, to our
I'm worried
nation.
about it.
It's outside of. I mean, obviously, I am a Democratic, operative who cares deeply about the Democratic Party, but you know what? I care about the country more.
Yeah.
And that seems to be getting lost. And this president has really, really driven into these divides, and it is shaking us to the core. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Haven't really seen.
No, I think that's. I surely haven't seen it. Yeah. I will say that I have never seen anything like this. And as I travel around the country and we see, particularly for Emily's list, this wave of women who are coming into the political process. For us, it's women saying they want to run for office, but on the ground, it's women marching and organizing and pulling their communities together. This is not the direction they want to go.
Yeah.
They believe in community. They believe in family. They believe in bringing people together. And they're really, really afraid, but they're going to take action. And that's what's so powerful. But this is like we need 60, 70% of the population to take action now.
Yeah.
Which can't be just 50 at this point. We got to go. We got to save our democracy.
I want to get to all of that. I don't want to lose track of your own story. So I want to go back to Butte for a second. Tell me what Butte was like, because there was labor activism in Butte when you were growing up, and you must have been exposed to that.
I always say, folks are like, well, how did you end up being a Democrat when, your parents weren't all that involved in politics? And I said, you got to understand, I grew up in Butte, Montana. It's like you're stewed in a Democratic working class labor, pot. Like it's everywhere. And you really did, even if it wasn't said to you directly, it was sort of understood that you were either with the company or you were with the worker. And that was it. And my parents, even though they did not work...
the big company there was Atlantic Richfield.
Yes, which in the early 1900s was known as the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, and then, of course, got bought up by Richfield and just, of course, got bought by a number of entities. This is a copper mining town, and it was so significant in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, obviously way before my time, that I tell folks out east. Yeah, of course. Nobody remembers there. When you think of all the phone, I always tell people, there used to be these phones that are attached to the wall in your house that you would pick up.
Yeah, exactly.
Remember those?
Yeah.
Yes, some of us remember those. Some of you may not. There actually were phones in the house. And all those phone lines that connected all those houses and all of the business all took copper. And out east, almost all that copper came out of Butte, Montana. Like that's how big and powerful that copper mine was in Butte, Montana. And the wars that happened between the Anaconda Copper Company and the unions and the organizing was historic. There's entire union movements and rules that came out of the fights in the copper mines in Butte. They were all shaft mines back then, and then in the I want to say early 50s, it became a big open pit mine. Now it's a big Superfund site. Yeah. Oops, we didn't do well on that front. That's why. So
there was a lot of labor unrest in the 80s.
Yes, and I remember when the workers went on strike once again. This is tough life. Working in a mine at the time, this was an open pit. They were driving these gigantic. If you can envision it, these gigantic dump trucks on these tiny little roads. It was so unsafe, and they go driving down to the bottom of this pit and get the copper out and then drive back, and they're fighting for better working conditions, better pay. And that year, in the early 80s, they went on strike. And the strike went on for a long time.
And you must have gone to school with a lot of the children of mine workers.
Who were either mine workers or affiliated. So many of those jobs in town were affiliated with the mine. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden you could feel everybody doing that. And my parents were like, well, we did the one thing we could do, which was, make some casseroles and bring them over to the union halls and just try to support the families because, of course, nobody was getting paid. This went on for over a half a year. That's a long strike.
And what did you take away from it?
Well, I want to say one last thing.
Yeah.
They closed that mine. And then they busted the union. And that's what I remember. I remember when they closed that mine. Now, I also know they closed the mine because copper prices collapsed at the same time. But as a kid, I saw that company knock out those families. And that was it. They had nowhere to go. And the town went from 36,000 to about 24,000 today. And it all started right there in front of me. And I just realized, you have to care about the working people. They have to have jobs. And if you can just knock it out that fast, that is how powerful those companies can be. Then we've got to do something about it. So that's where I come from.
And you add to it, what technology, globalization is doing.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of change going on, and there's an opportunity for people who are well positioned. And if you're not well positioned, it's completely disruptive. You made a decision pretty quickly that you were going to pursue politics. That was a conscious career choice of yours.
It was, and I always believed in, and still do today, believe in the power of good people getting elected and doing good things. And if you get the right people elected, you can make some real change.
Yeah.
All of the
right,
and yes, you do, and you have. Look at what you've done.
I'm in the Institute of Politics here.
Right.
The whole thing is premised on the notion that you can in a democracy that there's real power in that.
And look at what happens when you do have good people in there. It gets lost because the coverage is so often the mess of the big thing that they're trying to get done that everybody forgets to look at all of this. There's 1,000 small things that get done every day.
Yeah.
Everywhere, including in Congress, and people forget that, and we have to remind them. As I've recruited a lot of candidates over the years, and now, of course, a lot of women candidates. Sometimes the question is like, "What? I'm not going to get anything done. I'm just going to sit there and get beat up." And I said, it's just not true. And I tell the story, if I may, about working as Senator John Tester's chief of staff.
Yes,
which was such an honor. And
Senator from Montana.
From Montana. I was his campaign manager. After all my years of politics, I finally actually got to do a race in Montana in 2006. He won, and I became his chief of staff. And I'll never forget, he was doing, he's a huge champion of veterans. Montana was, and I believe still is, the second highest per capita number of veterans in the country. So it was a big, important deal. And he was doing a series of town halls, and he ran into a veteran who said, "You're not going to believe this, but I can't afford to get to the VA hospital." At the time, there's only one in Montana, and Montana is a big state.
Yes.
Because I can't afford the gas. And I only get 11 cents a mile reimbursement. And the senator called, and he said, "Do you think this is true?" I'm like, that can't be true. 11 cents a mile? That doesn't get you anywhere. And at the time, I think the federal level was, 46 cents probably. And even for those, and this is low too.
Meaning
but even
for federal workers.
For federal workers, right. Thank
Mm-hmm.
you. And these are folks that had to get there. We're like, well, we got to change that. Now, this is not some big national bill that's going to be covered on CNN, right? But he sat down, he rolled up his sleeve, he talked to a number of other colleagues. He's like, "How do I get this done?" And they're like, "Well, let's see if we can push it through." And it took a little bit of time, but not only did he get it to 23 cents, but I think he ultimately got it to the level of what a federal employee would get, which is what our veterans deserve.
Right.
But he did that, and he made that change for every veteran in the country.
Right.
Those are the things that we don't talk about.
And they happen all the time. And there are
time.
also, there's the ability to do things for people individually, who just have problems and they need someone to help them solve them. Look, I'm not cynical about the value of serving in public office, but I just know that it's a hard sell to some these days. Now, we're going to get to the fact that there are a whole lot of people who are raising their hand right now and saying they want to. But you bounced around. You did a number of campaigns at a very young age. Some as a finance director, some as a manager.
Yeah.
Tell me just what were the ones that stand out in your mind that were formative for you?
I always feel like my journey, every step of the way, you probably feel like this too, led me to the next thing, or
absolutely.
it's just all tied together. And I tell particularly up and coming, young folks who want to do this, I'm like, just keep going. The one thing I tell everybody is just say yes. When the opportunity comes up, if you can, say yes. Don't give it a second thought. Just go. Pack up your car and go, or move, or do whatever. But I would say, my first paying job. Big deal in campaigns. I got paid. Was working for Mary Reeder in Minnesota. She was running for Congress in 1996.
Gil Gutnick.
It was against Gil Gutnick, and I actually had convinced her that I should be her scheduler because I thought, I'll learn everything about the campaign that way, because everything has to go through a scheduler. Little did I know then that is one of the hardest jobs.
Yeah, that's a tough job, man.
I didn't know that then. I know this now.
The big word you have to learn is no.
Right. I did not know what I was getting myself into, and I ended up not doing it that long because I showed up on the campaign. They had just fired their finance director. And for every student who's done an internship, hear this one. I had done an internship at a place in Washington, D.C. that doesn't even exist anymore, in their development department, and they're doing fundraising, sort of. I mean, I didn't really do that much fundraising at the time. But that internship on my resume was enough for that candidate to say, "Would you like to be my finance director?" And I don't know what in the world I was thinking, but I learned that lesson, which is just say yes.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I said yes.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of my fundraising career. I learned a ton. And out of all ironies, Emily's List in 1996 sent out a finance advisor to Mary Reeder to teach this punk kid, Stephanie, how to learn fundraising and how you build finance plans and how do you do call time. And sure enough, we got Emily's List endorsement, and that was the beginning of everything. And then she did not win, but I stuck with fundraising for a long time until I went to management.
I want to jump ahead in your life journey to 2004 and Howard Dean. And you were the finance director for the Howard Dean campaign.
Yes.
We get a lot of credit, the folks who are involved with Barack Obama, for doing innovative things.
Yeah.
I would be the first to say that so much of what we did was derivative of and built on what Howard Dean did and what you did, especially as it relates to grassroots fundraising online on the internet, which was really pioneered in that campaign, as well as organizing on the internet, organizing meetups and so on.
That's right.
Tell me about the whole Dean experience, because I think that was when you think about losing campaigns that actually had an impact on American politics, I think that one was one of the big ones. And I know my buddy Joe Trippi was in the middle of all that.
He sure was. Yeah.
So tell me about that experience.
As I came out of that presidential campaign, I asked friends I'd known for a while, like, how long does it take to get over the loss of a presidential campaign? And they're like, at least 8 years. Yeah. And I laughed at them. That may be true. It was the campaign itself was the most amazing, crazy, thrilling, exciting, exhausting, painful, everything hurt at the end of that campaign. I've never felt as physically or emotionally exhausted than I did at the end of that campaign, because it was so high, so fast. I mean, folks who may not remember, so I came on that campaign in December of 2002. I was like one of the first 10 employees.
When was that?
When
was that DNC
early
meeting where he gave his? I want to represent. I'm here to represent the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party.
Yes, it was like late January, early February. It was like of 2003.
So right after you came.
Right after I came, yeah. And it was it caught so fast, and I went. And it was a stage in my career that I had been working at the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, sort of on a establishment path, to be honest, just like a very establishment path. And some folks on other presidential campaigns had talked to me about maybe joining them.
There were several establishment candidates.
There were a lot of establishment candidates that cycle, and I was more inclined in the fall of that year to go manage. I always wanted to manage at some point. But two things happened to me why I sort of took that diversion to someone who was not seen as the establishment candidate. One was the Iraq War vote, which I was very upset about. You've heard some of my Minnesota, like I went to school in Minnesota. I loved Paul Wellstone. And I was so proud of Senator Wellstone. And he voted against that war. And I just was so angry at so many of our Democrats at that moment. And I was just like, I don't think I can do this anymore. I can't be in this town. I was in my 20s. We are. We're like, right. I just can't do this anymore. And then we lost Paul Wellstone.
Right.
In a plane crash. And the combination of that for me was so devastating.
I actually think that
I had to go.
Yeah,
I had to go to Vermont.
I think that was a real watershed event for a lot of people, because there was a sense that a lot of Democrats cast that vote because they felt that the political winds were blowing that way, and they had to had to do it, and I think that kind of exposed something about politics that especially young people, was deeply disturbing, because I think young people want to believe that you're going to go there and you're going to do what you think is right, and here, clearly there were people who were putting their fingers to the wind. Not everybody. Our own senator here, Dick Durbin, did not vote for the war. Ted Kennedy did not vote that way. There were, people who didn't. And Barack Obama was a young state senator here. And he spoke out against the war, but most did.
Yeah. And the scrappy governor from Vermont spoke out against the war, Howard Dean. And, I got the call and they said, and honestly, it's so funny. He was so scrappy and had so little foundation that the call I got from his consultant was, Stephanie, do you know anybody that would take this job?
Yeah.
It was like, anybody, do you have any suggestions?
He's a pugnacious fellow.
Yeah. And I was like, I finally was like, what if I take the job? And that was it. I was on my way to Burlington, Vermont. And when I got there, we really had nothing. And it was during the time, nobody will remember this. I don't even remember this. Remember matching funds?
Yeah.
So this was the last era where there was a chance that a presidential candidate was actually going to accept the federal matching funds. And there's a whole process to get there. And there's a spending cap. So if you took the matching funds, you could only spend so much money. And I can't remember exactly how the system worked, but I knew that the maximum we could raise was like $36 million. That was the max. And so I wrote out a plan to raise $36 million. That was my job, and we got to get to $36 million. And I asked Howard, Governor Dean at the time, I said, so, how much do you think you could raise? And he said, I don't know, maybe $10 million. I said, I'm not taking this job unless we're serious about this. Like, we got to do the whole thing.
$10 million is a lot of money in Vermont.
It was a huge amount for him. He's like, well, how are we not going to get to over $30 million?
It's a lot of Ben and Jerry's.
It's a lot. Yeah. It's a lot. And we built it. And when I got there, we started putting together, but I will never forget, this is how new this all was. So there was a website, and there was a link on that website to donate. And I would get these cash flow documents of income coming in. And the first 2 weeks, there was this one line that just had it was like an account, and it had money coming in every day. And I went, well, what is this? Where's this coming from? We don't know. I'm like, what do you mean you don't know where the money's coming from? What is this from? And it took me, this is embarrassing, but it's true. It took us a couple days to figure out it was the merchant account on the website. See, nobody was getting money just over the transom on a website. I'd never seen it before. I'd done all this work with Senate races. I had never seen just money over the transom. No email ask, just coming in. And that's when I knew we had something really different. We didn't even have anybody managing the website at the time.
That's like Isaac Newton getting hit on the head.
It felt like it.
Yeah.
I was like, we got something going on here. We need help. And then thankfully Joe Trippi came on board. I hired.
And Joe was very fluent in sort of the internet. He was sort of a visionary on that.
Yeah, and he was great and very, very helpful. And I had always been very interested on the online fundraising, and I watched Move On, because Move On came up during the impeachment hearings of Bill Clinton. That's what Move On started. It was Move On from the impeachment hearings. And then after that, in 2000, they decided to support a couple of candidates who had defended Bill Clinton in the Senate. Who had gone against him. That's what it was. And so they did some fundraising, and it worked online.
Yes.
And we'd never seen that really before. So I had been watching this and really interested in how it was working, but I was not in the language of it yet, like Joe was, which was why it was such a good partnership.
And then I remember, because I was working for another campaign at the time, when your fundraising just exploded. And it was like a lightning bolt. All of Washington was shaken. I forget what your June filing was, but it was
7.6.
Yeah, it was big. And then in the fall.
For that time, which
that was
now
big.
doesn't sound big, I know.
Well, John Edwards raised 7.6, I think, in his first
first
filing. And everybody said, oh, my God, that's a huge sum of money.
It was a huge number.
And all of a sudden, here's Howard Dean, and he's doing it all in these small
It was all small increments. And it was small increments from everywhere. It was online, it was direct mail, it was telemarketing. We were doing these meetups, we called them,
yes,
where people are organizing, but they're also making small contributions. I used to call them pay to rally. They'd do rallies and they would just all make contributions. I'm like, this is like a pay to rally. You just do that. And we did all these other events too. Everything was on fire. But the June 30th of, which I'm sure like many remember on other campaigns because I hear about it still today.
Yes.
Like we at the Dean campaign decided to go live with how much money we were raising online.
So you raised this money and he took off. And, you know, in the fall of 2003 in Iowa, he was the man to beat.
Yes, he was.
And it really, I won't name who, but someone, I was in another campaign, as I mentioned, someone in your campaign called and said, look, this is over. Howard's going to win Iowa, and I want to talk to you about how this is going to go after and so on. And I mean, that's how certain people felt about this. What happened? Was the campaign, and was he prepared for being shot out of a cannon?
No. Nobody was prepared for what happened. The explosion happened over the summer. I mean, June was sort of the beginning of that. That July, he had full covers on 2 of the 3 big news magazines, which was a huge deal. Particularly then, the next quarter, we raised nearly $15 million, which surpassed the most amount any presidential campaign had ever raised in a quarter by $4 million.
Yeah.
But there was also a lot of shakiness going on in the campaign because what we had, like awesome, good people, but very green. Outside of a couple of us and Joe Trippi, but if you went like one step under, we're talking folks who these are first campaigns, or just like you start thinking about. At one point, I remember sitting with Joe and saying, "When do the people come to help us?" Like we were like sort of like they're coming, right? Because we're leading, and it's time for some of the more established people who do these races. I mean, I even felt like that as the finance director. I'd never been a finance director for presidential campaign. It was working. It was like they're going to come soon, right? I mean, there was sort of a sense of, I'm not sure we can hold this together.
It's the old story that your strength is your weakness and your weakness is your strength. There was a beautiful sort of purity to the Dean campaign, but there also was a lack of experience.
Yes, and you have to have, I think you just have to have both of those things. You need some experienced hands, but you need the energy of youth and newness to make those work. And one of the things we also did, and it's a failing of, I take personal responsibility, I hope others do as well, we ran our guy into the ground. I mean, we really, it was one of the lessons I walked away with. I walked away with many, but you cannot exhaust your candidate. And we exhausted him. Yeah. It was just exhausting. Nobody was thinking clearly, and no one was sleeping. And the pressure, and you know this better than anybody because you've done, a handful of these presidential campaigns. The pressure of a presidential campaign itself, the recognition that once you're the front runner, you hadn't even really thought about being president, and all of a sudden it's not a house race, right?
Everything you say, it's like nothing else.
It's like nothing else. The weight of the world is on your shoulders.
We've got probably about 6 million Democrats planning to run for president now, and no one really knows, or very few. Some of them have run before, what this is like, but the better you do, the harder it gets. It's like pole vaulting. You clear the bar and the bar gets raised. And
that's right.
I think there was a clear sense that, and by the way, it's worse today than ever because of social media.
Correct.
And cable and at the ferocity that cable runs today, and the pace, and so you are constantly under a microscope, and everything you say can be consequential, and but of course that's true of the presidency as well.
Trippi always said the thing about the presidential primaries and the presidential election is that if you survive it, you get to be president.
Yes.
And most don't survive the process itself makes the president.
I believe that's strongly.
And I think that's true. That's absolutely true. And that it's so, because nobody knows. Nobody who's going to run.
Now,
knows.
We've had a perverse sort of test of this, because you got a guy who seems impervious to any concerns about the impacts of what he says, and therefore he was willing to say anything that he thought might be marketable, and that has its own issues. So he's in a special category.
Yeah, he is.
But let me ask you about you managed the Tester race, as you said, which was a great win for the Democratic Party. And John Tester is a wonderful guy,
he sure
just
is.
As decent a person as you'll find in that Congress. Farmer, missing three fingers.
Yes, he is.
Got the flat top, but just the best, the best guy.
Absolutely.
In 2008, they sent you in to save Al Franken, who had a very tough race.
Yeah, he did.
Then, I think he wrote about this. Partly blames us for it, because we didn't exactly ride to his rescue in that campaign, which was a mistake. Would have saved everybody a lot of time and money. It would have saved about. Because Al Franken didn't get seated for 6 months.
Right, and folks ask me, because the point of that is we all believe that if the Obama for America plane had landed at the last weekend in Minnesota, that we would have just gotten the few extra votes we needed, and that didn't happen. It landed in Iowa instead, and you got to make your decisions. But I do remind people what that cost. One, simply, it cost $12 million of Democratic money to get through the recount and the trial and everything. He didn't get seated. But what it really cost was a huge cut in the stimulus package.
Yes. Yeah.
Because you needed another vote.
Right.
And you had to get Olympia Snow.
Right.
And to get Olympia Snow, there, if I remember correctly, there was hundreds of millions of dollars cut out of that stimulus package.
I can't remember whether it was Snow or Collins.
I can't either, and I apologize. I don't remember.
But there was Senator Nelson, who was a Democrat, also was on the same program. But there's no doubt that was a consequential thing, not having Franken in the Senate at that time. So I can't bring him up without talking not just about the way he got to the Senate, but the way he left the Senate. And I've said, candidly, that you shouldn't say that about yourself. That's never good when you say, I said candidly. Well, what about the rest of the time? Are you not candid? But I've said, I regret what happened to him, because what he was asking for was a hearing. He never got the hearing. No. I felt like he was collateral damage in pursuit of the Alabama Senate seat, because he was an inconvenient problem for Democrats as they were heading into this race against Roy Moore. And I think it was unfair. But I want to ask you, because of the position you hold, and you're right there, and the Me Too movement is driving a lot of our politics right now.
That's right.
and driving a lot of candidacies and a lot of energy, and I think in a positive way.
That's right.
But in this case, it feels like it was politics run amok a little bit.
It was such a painful time for everybody involved, and I think that's important to note here. It ended up being a perfect storm that we just nobody could pull him out of. And that is incredibly frustrating. What I will say, he was never going to do anything that wasn't going to help the people of Minnesota. And when it became clearer and clearer, particularly when the senators started calling for his resignation, that he was going to have a hard time doing his work. And he loves Minnesota, and did not want to do anything to hurt or damage the people there. But the moment itself, it's so important that women feel like they can tell their story, and we need to listen. And that's what Me Too is about, right? And thank goodness, because it's been, thousands of years where women haven't been listened to at all, right?
Absolutely.
And they do need to be listened to, and they needed to be taken seriously. And that's really important. We also need to have processes in place to figure out like what should be done and what the ramification of a situation should be. And what the problem, I feel like, was in Congress, and by the way, still is today, is that there's no clear process. Mm-hmm. Like there was no immediate ethics committee hearing. There was no immediate conversation about what to do next. There's no HR, human resources department really in these institutions in Congress, and so there's just no one really knew what it was going to happen in a real way. And yes, there's going to be an ethics committee, but it was going to be 6 months later, and that wasn't good enough for that moment. And you're right. Then there was Roy Moore just staring there like heavy
duty. Well, both parties had, the Republican Party had an interest in stringing the Franken thing out. Democratic Party had an interest in cutting it short. The Moore thing was coming down, and within days of
and you had more women coming out,
right?
Saying they'd had these these not pleasant experiences with the senator, who before he was in the Senate. By the way,
right.
None of it was during the Senate, and and so it was just an incredibly frustrating moment. The other frustrating part. Because I am heartbroken over the whole thing.
The odd thing about it was he apologized, and not that alone was not that's not a pass to get out of what you, but it seemed like he was earnestly trying to address this, and the people who were denying what they had done were getting a pass. Now Roy Moore ultimately didn't get a pass, but you do have. Still accusers
in the White House.
Yeah, exactly.
To be blunt,
right, exactly. So, I mean,
no, it was awful. But the other thing that was happening, though, and I want to speak to this because it was really hard. Particularly the women in the Senate were looked upon as the leaders. Like, what are we supposed to do? And the press and everybody was on them every single day. And then so there's that, so when you start just building up the pressure, and the pressure's building. And we had, and understandably, particularly young women, it's a generational difference we have found on what should be the punishment. But younger women are done. They're done. They can't even believe we're dealing with this stuff anymore. Yes. And so you'd walk into your office and look at your fabulous young staff who's working so hard for you, and they're all looking back at you going, why is this guy still here?
Right.
And that was real. And that happens all the time. So this is such a complicated moment, and it's so important for us as we move forward. We've got to get clear processes in place for, whether it's, if we can't get them in place in Congress, what is the waitress at the diner going to do? We have got such gigantic problems across this country with sexual harassment in the workplace. And we got to start dealing with it right in Congress first, and then start putting in, there are things we can do in this country to help women and have these conversations. So we've got to start doing it. And I really hope to see that Congress, and I don't even know why this would be a partisan thing. I don't understand why all of the leaders don't get together and go, what, there seems to be incidences on both sides. We just got to fix this. Why can't we do that?
I have to ask you about Hillary Clinton. We met at one point and talked about her. And I know that you were someone who people thought of as a potential manager of that campaign, and I know you were invested in it. Yeah. What happened in that campaign? I mean, I know what happened. I know, but it's not good enough to me to say Russians, Comey, and all of that, all of which were. But as a campaign professional, what was your analysis of what happened?
Well, I think you've got to start with what we were going into early. Forget about Donald Trump. When that campaign started, it was clear to us at Emily's List that we had an uphill battle because it was a change environment.
Yeah.
We just had 8 years of a Democratic incumbent.
Not easy to elect a party for a third term.
It is really hard to elect a party for a third term. It can be done, but that is that. So first off, we knew we were going into that environment. We knew in our polling at Emily's List that millennials, the millennial vote, wasn't all that excited about. Didn't really know her, to be honest. Which is so hard for you and me. We all know her, right? Mm-hmm. They knew some things about her, but there wasn't sort of a fully rounded picture of who Hillary was. So that was a problem. We knew that early on. And so you got those things. Oh, and by the way, we've never elected a woman as president. So we don't have any idea really deep down how folks are going to feel about that. So that was sort of the beginning. So that's the beginning challenges. And then, we've got, what I would say was, a constant beating on, the emails in Benghazi. And I often said, particularly when we got to the general election, it's like every day it's the same, 2 or 3 things against Hillary Clinton. It's the same, boom, boom, boom. Donald Trump, there's 20 terrible things to talk about with him today, but there's so many that nobody can focus on one. I still think that's the problem. That he's brilliant at that.
Yeah.
I think if we could all stick to one thing.
Starts a lot of fires, that's for sure.
It's amazing. He really does. And so that was not helpful. I'm not sure what I would have done to try to alleviate that situation. Maybe she needed to have more things bad happen, right? Maybe she needed to have 20, like Donald Trump. She only had 3.
Let me ask you a few questions.
But there is sort of a funny dynamic about
your
that.
Your neighbors in Montana or my neighbors in rural Michigan and so on. What it felt to me like there was too much reliance on this sort of demographic, theory that, if we got that women, that young people, that minorities, and so there's an emphasis on these issues to try and galvanize the base,
right?
And it made it easy for Trump to say, they don't care about you, they disdain you, the deplorables, and so on. And it seems to me that was a mistake. And the reason I raised it is because we're going into another campaign.
We are.
And it goes back to the issue we talked about at the beginning, which is, are we going to run, are we going to see a campaign, are Democrats going to run a campaign that speaks to a big, diverse country, or are they going to play a sort of demographic roulette again?
We have, in my opinion, to win a presidential campaign, you need to find a way to bring the country together with some excitement or joy or hope, which you did so well with President Obama. Folks are looking to be together. I've always believed. I think Americans want to be together. And so finding ways to bring us all together is the most important thing. And so I do worry about playing, as you called it, the demographic. We can't be like this niche group and then this group and this group and this group. Like, there is more that unites us. And we make a mistake by not using a vision that unites us together as Americans. There's a set of values, and I think they are Democratic Party values that extend into independents and a lot of Republicans. Maybe not all, maybe not like the core base of Trump, but a lot that's like every single American deserves an opportunity to earn a good living, to have a good living.
Seems like a unifying thing.
It does seem like a unifying, and then to believe it, and that I think that's really important.
I think it's also important to recognize that you need some big solid ideas about what that means in a time when we have this dramatic change in our economy and so on. So 2018, we've seen this absolute, avalanche of women, avalanche is probably the wrong, because they're moving forward, but just a stampede is the I'm
think
thinking about
of an
stampede.
Avalanche as, I like avalanche, not because sometimes it sounds dangerous, and it is. Avalanches are dangerous. But what's so powerful about an avalanche is it gets bigger as it goes down. That is what's happening. It is getting bigger as we keep moving away. It's just growing and growing every day.
Give the stats on how many women are running for Congress this year as opposed to past years. You must have that in the top of your head.
There are hundreds of women. There are hundreds of women running for the House right now across the country. I mean, I think we're still filing deadlines, so we don't even know yet how many. Emily's List is actively involved in races of over 70 now.
So
these are like key races that are going to swing over. I said to Leader Pelosi, I would like Emily's List to help deliver the majority by delivering the majority. We'd like to elect 23 women in pickup seats to give you the majority. Some good men can win too, and there are some good ones. Thank you, Connor Lamb. I'm thrilled that you're here. Jason Grow in Colorado, great job. There's some really good men. We really feel like there is an opportunity here to pick up 23 seats, maybe some more, with women, and what that would do to the caucus. But it's so much larger than the House. I mean, that's an important piece of it. I mean, we have a historic number of women running for governor now across the country.
And
the legislative seats.
Saw
and
it in
underneath
Virginia.
it, huge, historic numbers. And we're seeing that as filing deadlines close over and over and over again. We're on the ground doing some of the recruitment. It's almost like trying to get folks in the right places at the right time.
Well, this is an issue because
it's like, I don't even know. We're trying to put boundaries on it. We're just like, everybody needs to go. And we've got more primaries than we've ever had. I'm fine with that. I think it's great.
I don't want to close on a negative note, but every great thing has its potential challenges too. I remember when Emily's List was started by Ellen Malcolm, and the goal was to try and get women to run for office. Now you have this stampede or avalanche or whatever you want to call it of women running for office. And you have the situation, we just saw it here in the Illinois primary, and there's a suburban district here, Illinois 8, where I think there are 4 or 5 women running, and none of them won because they diluted each other's strength. And you've got, you have other districts. I think the 10th district in Virginia, which is a very competitive district, has a number of women running. I don't want to be parochial because men run against each other all the time.
Oh, for hundreds of years.
But
literally for hundreds of years.
But Emily's List, one of the strengths of it has been that is to sort of channel resources behind female candidates. This is a whole new thing.
It is.
And are you concerned about more situations like the one we saw in Illinois and also in California where they have this jungle ballot where so many Democrats run in a district that you're going to see Republicans slide into the general election who otherwise wouldn't have gotten into the general?
The California thing's a little bit different. I can address that too. But this is what I would say. I mean, I think this is all in all a good thing. We have been waiting and waiting for this many women to say, yes, I want to run. And we're winning a lot of races. I mean, you look at those Virginia delegate races, Democrats picked up 15 seats 11 of them were Emily's List women who won those seats. One of the news outlets a couple weeks ago said, with more women running, there'll be more women losing. I'm like, really? Yeah, that is true. Just like there's so many men who lose when they run as well, but there'll also be a lot more winning. And that's how it should be. There's no reason why there isn't a woman in every race in the country, period, right? I mean, there are, for the most part, men in every race, so there should be women. Our challenge is to, marshal our resources to get the most advantage out of the numbers. Like, we want to see a historic number of women in the U.S. House. We want to see them in the legislatures. How do we best do that? In some cases, we make hard decisions to go in with one woman over another woman. We're very careful when we do it. We look at viability. We look at personal story. We look at strength.
I think you did that in that Illinois race, didn't you?
We did. We did. In Kelly Mazzeski's race. Right. And try to get her there, and she was a close second, and it just didn't quite work. On the other hand, Lauren Underwood in Illinois 14 actually had the opposite situation. She was one woman, there were 5 men, right. She won by a lot,
right.
A lot. So we're seeing a little bit of a mix on these. That's okay. We've got more opportunity to win, and that's going to work. And I'm really excited about this moment, because this isn't just about 18.
Yeah.
This is going to be the next decades of leadership in this country.
Well, maybe it's about our country maturing.
I hope so.
To the point where men and women are fighting it out on an equal plane.
It's way beyond time for that.
It is. Stephanie Shriak, it's great to have you here.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Axe Files, part of the CNN Podcast Network. For more episodes of The Axe Files, visit cnn.com/podcast. and subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite app. And for more programming from the University of Chicago Institute of Politics, visit politics.uchicago.edu.